Well, I'm delighted to be here for multiple reasons. I did present my book here last year and had a terrific audience, and I think the Rumi Forum really is a great opportunity to discuss issues that need to be discussed in a nice informal way. And secondly, I've been in Afghanistan myself this year. I spent a month on a reporting tour in January and didn't get around the entire country, but got to see a few places. And to the extent to which there is progress, we can discuss this a little bit later. Dr. Gallagher today is going to be talking about stories from Afghanistan. She's the chair of the Middle East Studies program and a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Currently teaching at the UC California, that is D.C., the university's program in Washington. She was visiting Afghanistan in 2008 with a delegation of women interested in NGOs and has written a history of microfinance endeavors in Afghanistan. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Gallagher.
Thanks. I, again, will say a few words about microfinance and the positives and negatives of microfinance, which became, particularly when Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize, became the 25-cent word of the day. In 2001, when the U.S. defeated the Taliban government, microfinance organizations rushed to give aid to the Afghans. Only months after the fall of the government, the Aga Khan Foundation established the first microfinance bank of Afghanistan from funds from the International Finance Corporation. In 2003, the Afghan government established the Microfinance Investment Support Facility for Afghanistan, MISFA, with support from the World Bank. It was the first wholesale microfinance institute, initially under the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. There were soon 15 microfinance institutes giving small loans to poor Afghans, people who would otherwise be denied access to them. And for the first time, poor Afghans were able to obtain small loans. Now, there are nearly 900,000 loans with repayment rates of over 90%. Major donors are the World Bank, USAID, the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor. That's a group of 28 international donors. And the goal these days is for the MFIs to be transformed into banks that are sustainable and no longer rely on donations. In March 2006, MIFSA became a limited liability nonprofit company whose sole shareholder is the Ministry of Finance of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan with 15 partner MFIs. There's a board of directors elected by the donors. The donors are led by Canada and the United Kingdom, and they've provided more than $100 million to the agency. As of last year, about 500,000 clients, 60% women, had taken out loans in 20 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. And the hope is that the loans will fund small retail businesses, purchase of livestock, agricultural enterprises. Clients will get training and technical assistance. And this is the dream. However, critics note that most people in Afghanistan remain poor. Only 28% of adults are literate. Maternal mortality is the highest in the world. Access to safe drinking water is very limited. The educational system is dysfunctional. Many loan officers have been threatened. Microfinance banks have been robbed. Kidnappings and murders are common. On the other hand, and I'm going to go back and forth for a minute with some success stories and some questions. Here's something from the Canada International Development Agency, CIDA. A mere $200 loan is all it took to change the life of Sharifa and her daughter forever. The Afghan villager, struggling to survive in this war-torn area, used the loan to start her own business and invested in a rug loom and weaving supplies. She was soon able to hire other women weavers, freeing up her young daughter to finally go to school. As Sharifa pays back her loan, microfinance repayment rates are nearly 100%. She can borrow more to expand her business. She never thought of herself as a role model, but she's now advising other women in the region with a long tradition of rug weaving to take control of their lives, too. This is a lasting change in a part of the world where women are struggling to be heard. Another success story of the group we visited, and I'll show some slides later, Parwaz, which was established by Katrine Fakiri with the help of Global Exchange and Women's World Banking, has the stories of Shahnaz and Najiba. Shahnaz, one woman with several kids, was living in a mud hut next to a field that belonged to her neighbor. She'd been cultivating the field in exchange for 3 meals a day for her kids and herself. There were times when they were so hungry that they would eat grass. Parwaz gave her a loan 2 years ago. She bought a cow and started making yogurt and other dairy products to sell. She repaid the loan in 6 months. Parwaz gave her another loan and she bought another cow. In a year and a half, by buying 3 cows, the woman and her children are not indentured servants anymore. Now her kids are going to school and getting an education. She's standing on her own 2 feet and making a living. Najiba. Najiba went through one widowhood, and then according to tradition, she was obligated to marry her brother-in-law. A few years later, he was killed in the war, so her in-laws kicked her out and kept her kids because they said, "We cannot afford to feed you." She went to Pakistan, where she went from house to house washing wealthy people's clothes to survive. She came back to Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. Parwaz gave her a loan for a quilt-making business. She rented an apartment on her own and then went after her kids. She managed to get her daughters back from her in-laws. Parwaz gave the daughter a loan as well. Because of their business, they have a decent life now. They don't have to rely on anyone else to survive. And finally, Mercy Corps. Nasima fled to Kabul with her family in 1999 after the Taliban set fire to their village in northern Afghanistan. Like many residents in the mountainous region's northern area, Nasima's family built a one-room shack in Kabul's mountains where thousands of the city's poor live in illegal tenements. With missiles flying and the violence showing no signs of abating, Nasima, like many others, ran the risk of being turned into an impoverished refugee in her own country. That was until Sharifa Hashimi, a loan officer for the Microfinance Institute, MFI, this is Ariana, lent her $150 to set up a small shop. 4 years later, the canteen Nasima opened near her house with the loans helped supplement her husband's construction job income. Now Nasima is part of a group of borrowers who provide support for one another. So these are the goals and in a way the dream. But critics point out that these loans typically have a high interest rate of 20 to 30% per year or higher. The MFIs typically respond to that, yes, but the higher interest rates are necessary because of the expense of processing small loans under difficult circumstances. But the wealthy can get loans of 3 to 6%. On the other hand, the United Arab Emirates-based bank has started loaning to MFIs to in turn offer lower interest rates by guaranteeing the loan. So it may be possible to see if there can be some change in this 20 to 30% interest rate. What was the original idea of all of this? The Grameen Bank, founded by Muhammad Yunus, was to form self-help groups of women who pledged to change their lives in important ways. They had to take 16 decisions in the Bangladeshi context, which would change their lives. But in Afghanistan, the effort to form groups and to take decisions and change their lives has been lacking. Training clients, which was part of the original concept, takes time, it takes money, it takes energy. And more than a few of these MFIs have come to see their role more as investors intending to make money more than reformers launching a social movement. There's a big difference. And also, because of inadequate civil laws in Afghanistan, the system is prone to abuse. Very often, experts from the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, AREU, and I'll show some PowerPoint about this organization, loan officers look the other way when rich villagers organize poor villagers to get loans. Then the loans are used for the purposes of the rich villagers, the headmen of the villagers. So the loan officers get their commissions, the MFIs their fees and interest. The rich get the money and the poor are saddled with debt. Also, Afghanistan lacks the legal framework to regulate loans and defaulters. Many have compared microloans to the subprime crisis in the West. Loan terms are opaque. Borrowers don't understand the loans. Banks enable people to borrow money they can't pay back. There's no regulation. They know that the loans will then be covered by the government or by the international donors to bail them out. And there are problems with marketing products, with security, with information flow, with fraud, and with training. One hope lies in Islamic microfinance. Many Afghans are reluctant to take loans that require interest because they view those loans as incompatible with Sharia law. You all know what Sharia law is, Islamic law. In Afghanistan, the Foundation for International Community Assistance, FINCA, has entirely switched to Islamic loans, in which the bank and client make a contract of sale. How does it work? The bank purchases goods sold to the customer for agreed upon markup. This is like a service charge, and it's approved by fatwa. The consumer then pays the bank for the goods in installments. And there have been success stories here too in Islamic microfinance loans. For example, after spending several years in Iran as a refugee struggling to make a living working in a beauty parlor, Sharif never imagined one day she would have a business of her very own. Shuperi Sharif and her family fled to Afghanistan during the Taliban region in 1996. In 2002, the family returned to Kabul. Sharif began teaching school-aged children in her home. Last year, the 34-year-old mother of three took out a microfinance loan from the Foundation for International Community Assistance, FINCA, to expand her school. After successfully paying off her loan, Sharif's loan officer encouraged her to use the skills she learned in Iran to open a beauty parlor in her neighborhood. This was inconceivable under the Taliban. Sharif immediately saw this as a good opportunity. She says, "I had never taken a loan before. It gave me a lot of confidence to see that I could borrow money in my own name and pay it back. In Iran, as an Afghan, I would never have had an opportunity like this." But she was one of many thousands of Afghans who refused to take out interest-bearing loans. So, following the guidelines of Murabaha lending, the Murabaha Islamic loan pattern, she went to her, along with her loan officer, to buy items such as tables, mirrors, and chairs for the beauty parlor. The goods were then sold to Sharifa at a 2% markup, which she then paid back in monthly installments. And for her, this was acceptable, morally acceptable, and it proved to be also better for business. Now, what about all this microfinance? And I'm going to conclude now so we can have a conversation and questions. Alice Amsden, who teaches at MIT and has written The Rise of the Rest, notes that with all of this microfinance, poverty rates in these poor countries have not fallen. This is because, she said, in the presence of mass unemployment and an overabundance of small entrepreneurs, a better fed, housed, and clothed and schooled labor force usually can't find steady remunerative work. More education for women simply leads to more unemployment. Impoverished family firms are brain drained. What women deserve is greater efforts on the demand side by governments to create industries and jobs above the subsistence level. And The Nation's Alexander Coburn comments, governments like microloans because they allow them to abdicate their most basic responsibilities to poor citizens. Microloans make the market a god. Instead of demanding a living wage, strong job market, or a modicum of government-provided safety nets, the world's poor can pull themselves up by small bootstraps manufactured from the growing for-profit microfinance industry. It's capitalism's boutique solution to a wholesale problem. And others have commented microfinance has star power. After the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Mahmoud Yunus, he became the godfather of microfinance, some said. Natalie Portman, the actress, became a believer. She, on her website, she has a place where it says, "The end of poverty is just a mouse click away." A button on the site swiftly redirects you to PayPal.com, where you can make a contribution to microcredit initiatives. But on the receiving end, poor borrowers often say that their loans for their businesses this is the dream, against jump-starting the economy. They really use those loans for school fees, medical expenses, weddings, funerals. And I try to remind myself, I also donate online. The one I donated to most recently was for a young Afghan man in Kabul who needed the money to get married. There are, in conclusion, good and bad points to microfinance. When microfinance loans are used for things like medical expenses, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That helps families. Life gets better when kids can stay in school because their fees can be paid for yet another year. But what it doesn't do is get people out of poverty. To get people out of poverty, you need all of the things lacking in Afghanistan, and we're going to hear briefly about this now, like security, an end to this sectarian violence, warlordism, but also land reform, the problem of expanding poppy cultivation. You need follow-up. There are cases I didn't mention, I should have, that in some follow-ups where we read about these wonderful groups where women get goats and chickens through rural aid programs. A year later, you go back in, nobody has them anymore because the male family members have demanded them, the animals have been sold, and so forth. And finally, my last comment, I want to refer to a comment Barnett Rubin, you probably know Barnett Rubin, an Afghan expert, commented that up till now, in papers on the empowerment of Afghan women, U.S. Policymaking papers, women are still referred to as the soft underbelly of Islam. The U.S. remains a military and political opponent to many Afghans, much like the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And many Afghans still consider themselves resisting imperial expansion into their territory. And they consider women recruited by the NGOs to be their collaborators. What will happen when the donors leave, as they inevitably will? The women may be left undefended. So what should we think of all of these pros and cons? I think we should support MFIs in Afghanistan. We should encourage Afghan women to participate in them, but should do so by keeping in mind the wider historical context, the wider geopolitical and economic problems in the region, and some of the history that we're going to hear briefly about now. So let me pass the microphone to Roy, who will tell us a bit more about, and then we're going to adjourn next door to our PowerPoint presentation on these microfinance institutes, some of the women who have received funds, the schools, and other groups. Roy.
Well, what I might do that's useful, I hope, for you all is just recite a little bit of the history of what's happened in Afghanistan in the last 30-something years. President Obama made a major speech in December in which he announced reasons for sending additional forces there and staying at least 18 months and to try to deal with the security situation. What he left out, though, of that speech was the history of Afghanistan in the last period of time and why the U.S. And really its allies have, I think, an obligation to help them find a stable solution to the war that's now going on. There have been, in the last 30-something years, 5 wars in Afghanistan. You start with the one that was the subject of Charlie Wilson's war, the book and the film, and it was a war against the Russian army, the Red Army, intervened and invaded Afghanistan in 1979. and basically took it over and had a terrible time organizing the political leadership of Afghanistan, probably somewhat similar to what we're having now, what the U.S. is having now, but in its own way, because it was trying to install and protect a communist government there. And with the help of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, other countries, Afghans who were already naturally inclined to dislike invaders united, fought very hard, lost at least a million people in the course of the 1980s, but managed to force the Red Army to retreat in 1989. It was at the beginning of '89 that this all happened, formally at least. First time the Red Army really had suffered a defeat of that kind, a historic event. And again, this is the subject of Charlie Wilson's war. The U.S. Role at that point was triumphalist. We were all celebrating the great achievement that actually we did not fight for. We did not lose a single life over. Did spend some money for, but it was basically their achievement. Now, 1989 also, as you know, this was a fairly huge year in international history, because what happened in Afghanistan also gave heart to a lot of people throughout Eastern Europe who found ways, peaceful ways, in most of the cases, to overthrow communist government, to get rid of and the Red Army that had occupied there since World War II. It was at that point that there was a big question: what's going to be the future of Afghanistan? Because the Russians had left behind a puppet government led by a man named Najibullah, who had been the head of the secret police. Pakistan wanted to take a lead role and organized fighters to try to overthrow the Najibullah regime, and failed miserably because they didn't know anything about the use of force in the particular circumstances that existed then. For 3 years, basically, and this was the second war, various mujahideen without much organization, with fairly poor leadership, certainly, and with the Pakistanis trying their best to take over and doing very, very badly, failed to dislodge the Najibullah regime. And it was only when the Russians decided, after the attempt to overthrow the government by some super conservatives there, they decided to pull the plug on Najibullah. And at that point, a group named, they used to be called the Northern Alliance or the United Front, took power in Kabul. And there were some fairly, somewhat Western-oriented people like Ahmed Shah Massoud, the great guerrilla leader, who were in that government. At the same time they took power, however, the Pakistanis decided we're trying to keep up their pressure, and they supported another faction. And so for 3 full years you had this third war between former Mujahideen leaders. The outcome was a very, very weak Afghan state. The poverty that's just been described grew. The suffering grew. You know, at one point in the 1990s, there were at least 4 million Afghans of the population of 24 who were refugees abroad, mostly in Pakistan and in Iran. The United States was taking in no refugees at that time. It was scandalous, and frankly, none of us noted it or reported on it at the time. And the Taliban came to power in 1996. The state simply could not defend itself against them, and they were a popular movement, and they promised to bring law and order and an end to warlordism and all the other terrible isms that occurred under the Mujahideen regime. And then that began the fourth war, because the Mujahideen forces retreated to the northeast, Massoud in particular, and actually until just the eve of 9/11, Massoud was still holding out, and his forces were. He was attacked by people that bin Laden had sent there as journalists, ostensibly to interview him, but actually to blow him up and some of his colleagues. And then after 9/11, of course, you have the fifth war with the United States intervening. Very effectively with absolutely minimal forces, but using the remnants of Massoud's own forces and his allies like General Dostum. And now we're in the fifth war. I mean, it's very hard, I think, for an American to imagine living in a country, growing up in a country where all you know your entire lifetime is war. It's very hard to imagine, or being a refugee abroad. It's an appalling situation that exists even right now. For one thing, as Nancy was just mentioning, you have an absence of the rule of law. You have terrible governance in the provinces, in Kabul, in the country at large, and even down, in some cases, to the municipality level. You have an economy that is still really in ruins. It's beginning to pick itself up, but it's still a shambles. Under the Taliban, women were forced not just out of their government jobs, but they were forced off the streets, into their houses, out of education, out of all the roles that they had taken up. And ironically, during the communist occupation period, the women had some of the greatest advances. In the Taliban period, the regression was just complete. I think there was no country on earth where women were worse treated. So in this context, it seems to me the microfinance idea is a great one. Whatever the drawbacks, I think you need all the help you can get at every level. And the idea of giving women their rights, which was very much part of certainly the American line as we went in 2001 and helped create a new government, help bring some stability. This has been a very constant line among the American leadership there and the embassy there. But it's also caused quite a bit of unrest among Afghans. There are in places like Kabul and other major cities, the tradition of women getting educated, certainly in the later part of the 20th century, did take root, and women made a lot of advances. In the countryside, much less so. And it's been said that the Americans were pushing so hard, so fast, that in a way they helped provoke a reaction which is existing to this day. And so the Taliban, for a variety of reasons, had a revival. Right now, and this is why Obama had to send in additional forces, the Taliban are a genuine threat to the survival of the pro-Western Karzai government. And in the countryside, what the Taliban have been doing very often is attacking anything to do with women's progress. Schools where girls are educated, women's cooperatives, and other things have become their targets, and they basically charged the United States with acting in ways that are un-Islamic. The actual truth of it is, though, that women have throughout modern history in Afghanistan have pursued crafts and have done various activities like assisting in farming and so on. And the Taliban are a total throwback, to the 14th century or something. So there is a tug of war that's going on now between the Westernizers or the modernizers and if you want, the Islamizers. And I think that microfinance is a very important part of what the Western answer is to the people who want to put Afghanistan back several more centuries. So why don't I stop there? I do have one question for you, though, if I could, maybe just to kick it off. The idea of Islamic loans, of Sharia loans that conform with Sharia, is intriguing, but isn't it a kind of a deception? I mean, aren't people paying interest, but just under another guise?
Yes, they are. And I think everybody recognizes that, even in places like Saudi Arabia, where Islamic banks are the order of the day. It's generally recognized that the service fees or the gift at the end of the year is pretty much the same thing as interest in an indirect way. But it's Islamically approved, and there's more. It's often said that there's more oversight, and this different approach has a moral veneer that makes it more acceptable to people. And proponents of Islamic banking also argue that they've been very successful in giving loans to people that otherwise would have been reluctant to do so on a small scale and on a large scale. And and sometimes it's argued also that the amount, that service charge, shall we say, is less than more common or standard mainstream microfinance institutes charge.
So it's not the 20 or 30%, but it's several.
In theory, it's supposed to be, the service charge is supposed to work out to much less, in the order of 2 to 6%.
This reminds me, by the way, just to mention one other thing about the period of Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001. The Taliban really had no idea of governing. They had an idea of law and order, and it was very effective, quite frankly. They did end the roadblocks and the highway robbery. You could drive from one end of the country to the other. But as for an economy, they really had zero idea. And so a lot of the areas where Afghanistan actually did have positive economic possibilities, such as growing fruit and growing nuts and growing in other agricultural areas, just withered away because the Taliban had no idea about commerce or business. And so women were also going to, in that context, were going to suffer, but the whole population suffered totally. Anyway, should we start questions? Sir, I'm sorry, did you? Any, yeah.
I have a question. So,
you want to stand up and just tell us your name?
hi, my name is Jagriti Bhakta. I'm from the National Defense University. I have a question about the sort of divide that you mentioned between sort of large-scale Afghani development measures that need to be taken, and then sort of home or economic empowerment from individual perspective of the MFIs. I'm wondering, what ideas do you have about how to bridge that gap? I know there's a lot of microfinance institutions in a lot of different places around Afghanistan, but there's also issues that just can't be dealt with alone. Like, say, you can give out microfinance loans, but if there's no electricity to be had, how much of a growth can you have in your enterprise? So what are ways do you think that that gap can be bridged?
What you're calling for is the most difficult. You'd probably ask the most difficult question and call for the most difficult solution long-term that can be imagined. But there's no question that Afghanistan needs huge international investment and support. All of there needs to be a review to start with, the kind of review that Obama undertook a few months before he announced the, shall we call it a surge for Afghanistan, but a review over aid in general and how it's going in and what it's supporting, and it needs to be massively larger than it is right now. Once a modicum of peace and security can be established, there has to be real government safety nets, there has to be real education, there has to be real investment in agriculture and irrigation, in every aspect of commerce. You mentioned trade and commerce. There has to be support for Afghans to get their crops out of the country and bring others in, and there's, so it's just a very, very difficult situation. But as Roy mentioned, under the Taliban there was security. You can hear it very commonly said in Kabul today or Afghanistan today, it was better during the Taliban time. People say, at least we could get to school. What do you mean you couldn't go to school? Well, we had home schools, we had private schools, and you could get to them. Now we can't even get to the school. We can't send our girls because they're going to be attacked, they're going to be raped, we're not sure what's going to happen, they may not come back, so they stay home. And so in some cases literacy's gone down since the US occupation or since the fall of the Taliban. So it was all done on the cheap. There was a diversion of resources to Iraq, as everyone knows. The level of investment was far less, say, than in Bosnia or Kosovo, and that barely is holding together. So there has to be much larger international investment than there has been to date, and so that these issues you mentioned can be addressed. But you're right, this large-scale restructuring is what has to happen to get away from the micro. In the meantime, yes, microfinance is a great idea because it helps people in a day-to-day way, but you don't get out of subsistence living.
Well, of course, again, with microfinance, the reason that you need to help people acquire livestock is that what livestock they had to sell because of poverty, and so rebuilding their lives is a huge, and it really is family by family. The other thing I just want to mention is that, as I say, what I thought was missing in President Obama's presentation when he made it was anything about the history. The United States, the West, the world really benefited enormously by the sacrifice of the Afghans during the 1980s. I mean, the end of communism is one of the great events of my lifetime, certainly. And you know, it really happened there. It happened in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. It happened on the plains. It happened because a lot of guerrilla fighters were, you know, they were willing to lose their lives because their families went abroad. I mean, this is an incredible sacrifice by a nation with our help over a 10-year period. And what I thought President Obama left out of the equation, and that comes back to your question, is that doesn't the United States and its allies have an obligation to help put things right? And this is not just a matter of the next 18 months or the next 2 or 3 years. It's really a matter of a 10 or 20-year project. Afghanistan is going to need that much attention for that long. I don't see that the American government has committed itself to it, although it's taken several steps down the path, and maybe the decision will be made later. So I just want to...
Actually, a British authority commented 20 to 30 years, British expert on Afghanistan. And
I was at the low end.
Exactly, and this was greeted with horror, and he was forced to retract his statement, but everybody knew it was true.
It's a long commitment.
It's a long commitment, but I think it has to be done.
But you know, one of the interesting questions is, what'll it look like then? Will Afghanistan ever be a self-sustaining country? Will it ever be able to feed itself? Will it ever be a country? I mean, there's a lot of people who maintain that it is not a country, but it is a collection of fiefdoms that are sort of connected by some roads and occasional and some trade.
On the other hand, in the 1960s, Afghanistan was a developing country like many others. It was struggling, but it had its safe city center, it had its universities, it had its professional class. Women were being educated, there were doctors and engineers, and people were studying abroad and they were going back, and certainly there was the rural-urban divide that you mentioned earlier. But it seemed like it was moving along like other countries. Now it's said if everything goes right for Afghanistan in 10 years or so, it might get up to the level of Pakistan.
I mean, I will make one other observation. I think Afghans are people who, if you give them the means to do something, they can do anything.
Of course.
I find the ambition of so many young Afghans to build a real life, to get educated, to do something in their country and for their country, I found that almost universal. A lot of frustration with the fact that the United States had been playing a fairly superficial role, not really helping in the most basic areas of life, like governance and security. But a feeling that they want to get on with life and have a real country and have also an existence, an economic existence. So I personally think that there's possibilities there.
All they need is a chance.
But they need a chance, and this is again why microfinance really rings a bell as certainly one of the steps in the interim.
So with that, shall we adjourn and see our slides?
Did you have a question? Sorry.
Well, I'm John Langan from Georgetown University. I guess I'm puzzled because what this comes to is a rather benign version of stay the course. And I wonder if that is sustainable given the great difficulties and frankly the unattractive qualities that the two most concerned governments in the region present. That is, Karzai government in Afghanistan and whatever regime may come to dominate in Pakistan. What are your thoughts about the political base in the region that needs to be present?
Yeah, my view is not stay the course. My view is not, as I said, I think we have to I wish the government would undertake another kind of review that Obama undertook earlier, just a few months ago, and start over again, because I don't think the current military surge is the right approach to it. And what we heard about Marja and the idea somehow that all could be put to right in this fashion, it's not the case in Afghanistan, it's also not the case in Iraq, but that's another story. And I think that the shift needs to be in an entirely different direction. I would not have sent the additional 30,000 troops, and I would have looked much more to a social and economic reform that is needed.
I would respectfully disagree. I don't think there's any way around trying to turn change the balance on the military side now, which at this present time favors the insurgents and it favors the return of the Taliban. I think, and the reason for that is not that I could predict the outcome, and not because Afghanistan will be at peace then, because quite frankly, until you have good local governance, until you have security that is provided by Afghans for their own country, you cannot have a stable state, and to have to rely on outside countries like the United States is a formula that just will not be sustainable. But the major reason is that if you pull out American forces now, or if you don't try to counter the Taliban's significant advances of the last 3 years, that the vacuum that you'll create there will be one that is going to invite radicals from the entire region and maybe the entire Islamic world, frankly, to come back as they did in the 1990s. And the last thing I think we'd want is a reversion to that. But does the U.S. military have the capability of actually changing the balance? That is, to me, the real question, because you really don't want to go into this if the prospects are so grim. I thought the most interesting thing that happened, certainly during my time in Afghanistan, was when General Flynn, the head of intelligence, U.S. military intelligence, is part of the International Security Force, ISAF, co-edited a paper where he critiqued U.S. intelligence gathering and the application of U.S. intelligence over the previous 8 years. He was scathing. It was a devastating paper. It's one of the best papers I've read in a long time, because, you know, journalists, we like to think of ourselves as telling truth to power, as if we know the truth, as if power will listen to us. But still, this was somebody from the inside critiquing the U.S. government and the U.S. military, and saying that essentially what they were doing was looking at Afghans, looking at the country in a kind of an abstract way, not as a real place, not as real people, not finding out what are the political arrangements, what's the political history of each region, of each district, but using basically Afghanistan as a way of attacking Al-Qaeda, who had fled into Pakistan or into the tribal areas, but not focusing on the needs of Afghanistan and how to stabilize Afghanistan. And not asking questions, not really getting to know the country, and the people. And the critique was so harsh, but for me as a journalist, it rang a great bell, because this is exactly how we operate as journalists. We have to go out and talk to real people on the ground and try to find out what is going on, and why is the district around Gardez, a town that I did visit, so unstable right now. How have the Taliban managed to infiltrate back into that key part of southeast Afghanistan? And why? Well, it's because of the total they were so ready after 9/11, after the U.S. intervention, to move forward, and instead what happened was the Karzai government made deals with the political cronies in order to win elections and stay in power, and appointed total misfits who were utterly corrupt into the key security positions in places like Gardez. So these are some of these problems are, if not made in USA, they were created on our watch, and they were created by the failure to understand this is a country of regions, this is a country of districts, this is a country of cities, and you cannot and towns, and you cannot just treat it as a military platform. So that's why I think, frankly, I don't see that the United States has a choice right now in terms of its own national interests, but to try to change things on the strategic level, on the military level, that is to say, because there really is an existential threat to the current Afghan government. But that will be also a failure if the U.S. doesn't deal with things at the district level, at the provincial level.
Okay, let me ask, by way of maybe the final comment, to think about why it is that we keep hearing about the effectiveness of the Taliban fighters. They are increasingly gaining in sophistication. They undertake missions that seem impossible. They carry light weapons. They move very fast. They attack. They are undercover. It's not clear who they are, where they go. Yet they come back. They're supposedly wiped out, and yet they come back again. in a way, they're often described as fierce fighters with an uncanny competence. And yet the Afghan troops that are fighting with the Americans are talked about almost in the opposite terms. They have weak morale, they don't clean their weapons, they don't shoot straight. When they were in this recent Marja offensive, they went in and they looted the local market. How could this be? They were supposed to be liberating the people from the hated Taliban, and yet they went right in and took everything the people had in the area they were supposedly saving. So how can we understand that? So let me leave you with that.
Well,
that point.
You know, and every one of your observations is correct. That this is describing, but this is the problem that I was trying to describe, that the security forces there during our watch were not trained sufficiently, were not recruited properly, were not paid above all, and I mean, there's a fairly small pool that you can actually recruit from when you come down to it because of the illiteracy. One of the reasons that local police, and I heard this anecdote when I was in Gardas, are so bad is and cannot be trained is that they're not able to read and write, and explaining to them what the law is and that what they're supposed to do to uphold the law, it goes in one ear out the other. In particular, because they're not adequately paid. So there's a whole problem about creating a government. But this is but again, coming back to my original description, after 30 years of war and a Taliban period. It's a challenge, but the question is, can it be met? Can it be responded to? I think the jury's out. I don't see much choice in going ahead.
The Taliban also can't read or write. It's the same people very often. In fact, sometimes they are the same people because they're recruited, they take their weapons, and then they turn them over to the Taliban, or they sell them sometimes to the Taliban. But the bigger issue is us, again. The Americans go in there, they're contractors with DynCorp. They don't know the local languages, they don't know the local customs. They're very often policemen who are recruited under a contract. They get paid far more there than here. They count the days and the minutes and the seconds so they can go home. They're motivated by money to go there and train the Afghans, and they don't have the kind of commitment, and the conditions they're working under are also miserable. It's not fun to be there. They're often their base is not in the cities, and again, they don't know the languages, the people, the customs, and you could argue even that the reason some other forces, the Italians, have had somewhat better results is that they're using a different approach to training the Afghans in much more hands-on, when they're much more closely associated with them and living with them and working with them in a different kind of a psychological pyramid to what the Americans usually adopt, and also the Germans and British, but mostly the Americans I'm speaking about here. So you don't get a good result. The Afghans say all the time, here we are, we're making it at most maybe the equivalent of $100 or $200 a month. And yet we see these, and we're wearing light armor, we're poorly uniformed, we can barely carry our weapons because they're small people, and what the Americans give them, the Kevlar and so forth, weighs maybe 100 pounds, and they maybe weigh, I don't know, at best 140 pounds. And the Taliban, on the other hand, are just going around in their everyday clothes with a weapon, Kalashnikov, which they know how to use since the Soviet times and have long experience with. Maybe I'm digressing a little too much, but then the Afghans who are fighting with the Americans see these people, and they know, everybody knows that it takes at least, I don't know, how much do you think a month for a consultant to be paid, housed, and fed? What do you think the average is?
Thousands of dollars.
Thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Maybe $10,000.
Yeah, maybe $10,000 per. They say it's $1 million a year per one head for one American expert, and this is all of the expenses. And they do make very large salaries when you add the combat.
Don't forget the Taliban's.
But that
Taliban pay salaries too. So you have.
No,
and that was one of the problems.
This is a huge gap between what the Afghans fighting with our forces under our training make, and they see these others with their gigantic embassies. Millions of dollars has been allocated to upgrade the U.S. embassies in the area in Afghanistan and also Pakistan, and the compounds and the villas they live in, and the cars, the SUVs they go around in. So then you know, why should I fight? You know, they're gonna. If I don't fight, they will. And there's not a good. If it doesn't sound like Vietnam, it ought to. Where the Viet Cong, where the southern Vietnam, they just wouldn't fight. They just weren't they're keen on things. And whereas the north, the Viet Cong, were really dedicated. in any case, I don't want to go on forever with this, but I know you all have things to do. But
well,
I think we have to
go to the other
go to the other room and see some happy slides.